Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something that's really woven into the fabric of modern life, man-made electromagnetic fields, or EMFs.
hmm
From our smartphones to, the Wi-Fi signals humming in our homes, we're just constantly surrounded. And, well, if you're like many, you've probably wondered about the potential impact on our health.
That's right. And to really get to grips with this, we've dug into a pretty fascinating scientific review. It's from 2019 by Pentecoste Crusoe. It's called Shielding Methods and Products Against Man-Made Electromagnetic Fields: Protection versus Risk.
Okay.
Our aim in this deep dive really is to explore the science of EMF shielding, to understand what it truly offers in terms of protection, and importantly, to uncover any potential risks that might be lurking, beneath the surface.
Right.
Ultimately, we want to help you, the listener, decide, based on the science, if those EMF shielding products you see advertised everywhere are actually a worthwhile investment.
Exactly, because, you look around, exposure to EMFs from things like cell towers are like ever-increasing collection of personal gadgets. It's undeniably on the
It
rise.
really is.
And along with that, we're hearing more reports of people experiencing things like headaches, anxiety, sleep problems, which some link to this exposure, a condition sometimes called electrohypersensitivity, or EHS.
Yeah.
Plus, it's worth remembering, groups like the International Agency for Research on Cancer have classified certain types of EMFs as possible carcinogenic, so it's only natural to look for solutions.
And that's precisely why there's this whole industry built around EMF shielding now. You can find everything from like special paints for your walls to little chips you stick on your phone, all promising to reduce your exposure.
Hmm.
So the crucial questions we're really digging into today are, how does this shielding actually work? Does it really do what it claims? And critically, are there any hidden downsides we should all be aware of? Let's maybe start with the basics. How does metal actually block these, well, invisible fields?
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that. What's the core principle? How can a metal barrier stop an electromagnetic wave?
Well, the key really lies in the electrical nature of metals.
Yeah.
They're packed with what we call free electrons. These are electrons that aren't tightly bound to individual atoms and can move quite easily.
Right.
When an electromagnetic wave, which has an electric field component, hits a metal, this electric field basically sets those free electrons in motion.
Uh-huh.
Their movement then generates an opposing electromagnetic field, which in effect reflects the original wave away.
So does that mean if a metal has more of these easily moving electrons, if it's more conductive, it's a better shield?
Precisely.
Yep.
Higher conductivity means more effective reflection of that electromagnetic energy. This is the whole principle behind a Faraday cage, that conductive enclosure you might have seen in science demos.
Ah, okay.
It's designed to block external electric fields by creating this continuous conductive barrier.
Right, like a cage that protects something inside from lightning, for instance. Now, the paper also mentions that certain metals, ferromagnetic ones, are even more effective. What's special about those?
Yeah, what's fascinating there is that ferromagnetic metals like iron or nickel, they go a step beyond just reflecting the electric part of the EMF.
Oh.
They also interact with the magnetic component. These materials can actually absorb and redirect magnetic field lines, effectively reducing the strength of the magnetic field in the space beyond the shield. So a shield made with a ferromagnetic metal can offer like a more comprehensive reduction of the entire electromagnetic field.
That's a really useful distinction. Okay, so metal can be effective at blocking EMFs from outside.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets, well, really interesting. The paper points out that this shielding isn't very selective about which EMFs it blocks.
No.
And it can even trap and potentially increase EMFs inside a shielded area. How does that trapping effect happen?
Yeah, this is a really important point to understand, because the metal acts as a reflective surface for electromagnetic waves, right?
Mm.
Any EMFs that are generated inside a shielded space, think about your Wi-Fi router, inside a room painted with shielding paint, for example,
Right.
will also be reflected. Instead of radiating outwards and dissipating, these internal EMFs just bounce around within the enclosed space.
Ah, okay.
And this can lead to a buildup in the overall EMF levels inside, potentially increasing your exposure to those locally generated fields. It's kind of like sound waves echoing in an empty room. They get trapped and can become intensified in certain spots.
So that makes sense.
So the takeaway here is that metal doesn't just block the potentially bad EMFs, it blocks everything, and it can even exacerbate the ones you're generating yourself inside.
That's a really crucial point if you're thinking about, turning your bedroom into some kind of shielded box. Now, the authors of this paper, they actually did a pretty simple experiment to get a sense of how effective a basic metal grid could be. What did they find?
Well, their experiment, while straightforward, gave some valuable insights. They used a basic galvanized iron grid and measured how much it reduced the 50 hertz electric and magnetic fields coming from a simple lamp switch.
Okay.
And they found a pretty significant 70% reduction in the electric field strength. The magnetic field was reduced by less, but still measurably, about 13.33%. Then, they tested the same grid against a radio frequency EMF around 1950 millihertz, which is in the range used by mobile phones, and saw about an 80% reduction.
And the authors specifically note that the Schumann resonances, which we're about to get into, fall into that same low ELF frequency range as the power line EMF they tested.
Exactly.
So this gives us a tangible idea of how even a basic metal barrier could also affect these natural background EMFs.
Precisely. And this leads us to what is maybe one of the most surprising and important aspects discussed in the paper, the role of these natural atmospheric EMFs, known as Schumann resonances. What exactly are these, and why should we as biological beings actually be concerned about them?
Okay, so imagine the Earth and its upper atmosphere, the ionosphere, acting like the two shells of a giant, very low-frequency radio antenna. Global lightning activity is constantly sending out electromagnetic waves, and certain low frequencies get trapped and resonate within this Earth ionosphere cavity. Those are the Schumann resonances. They have a fundamental frequency of around 7.8 hertz with a series of weaker harmonics at higher frequencies, up to about 45 hertz or so. It's like the planet itself is kind of humming at these very low electromagnetic frequencies.
And what's truly remarkable, and what the paper really highlights as a potentially crucial link, is the striking overlap between this fundamental Schumann resonance frequency, 7.8 hertz, and the alpha brainwave rhythms in humans, which typically range from about 7.8 to 13 hertz.
Oh.
This close match suggests a possible, maybe even fundamental, connection between these natural environmental signals and our own brain activity. The crucial insight here is that our bodies seem to have evolved in the presence of these subtle natural EMFs.
That is a fascinating coincidence. So are these Schumann resonances just like passive background noise, or do they actively play a role in our biology? This is where that pioneering work of Rutger Weaver comes in, right? In those underground bunkers. Tell us about those experiments.
Yes, Rutger Weaver conducted some really groundbreaking experiments back in the 1960s and 70s. He had volunteers live for extended periods in two identical underground apartments, completely isolated from the outside world and the normal light-dark cycle.
Okay.
Crucially, one of these apartments was shielded with multiple layers of iron, which dramatically reduced the intensity of natural atmospheric and even static terrestrial EMFs. They measured something like a 99% reduction in the static magnetic field.
Whoa.
And the volunteers themselves, they didn't know which apartment they were in.
And what were the key differences they observed between the volunteers living in the shielded apartment versus the unshielded one?
Well, the most significant finding was that the circadian rhythms, their natural sleep-wake cycles of the people in the shielded apartment started to drift. They became desynchronized from the typical 24-hour day.
How so?
Their activity and rest periods stretched out, in some cases reaching as long as 28.5 hours. This internal desynchronization simply didn't happen in the control group living in the unshielded apartment.
That's a pretty dramatic effect just from blocking these natural fields. But they didn't stop there, did they? They tried introducing an artificial field into the shielded environment.
They did, yes. In the shielded apartment, they introduced a weak, pulsed 10 hertz electric field again, without the subjects knowing. And what they observed was that this 10 hertz field effectively restored the synchronization of their biological rhythms.
Really?
Yeah. When the generator was turned off, the desynchronization would start up again. And interestingly, just introducing a static electric or magnetic field didn't have the same restorative effect.
So the clear conclusion from this research seems to be that these natural atmospheric EMFs act as a fundamental timekeeper, like a kind of pacemaker for our biological rhythms, helping keep our internal clocks aligned. And this is independent of the cues we get from light and darkness. That's a really profound insight.
It truly is. And the paper emphasizes that long-term disruption of these natural rhythms, this internal desynchronization, has been linked to a range of health issues, things like depression, sleep disorders, and maybe even an increased risk of certain cancers.
Wow.
The underlying idea is that living organisms, including us, function partly through subtle electrical activity.
Yeah.
Ions moving across cell membranes, electrical signals in the nervous system. These natural EMFs seem to play a role in attuning and synchronizing this fundamental biological activity. It's almost, well, unsettling to think that something we can't see or feel could have such a profound impact.
It really makes you reconsider our relationship with the whole electromagnetic environment. The paper even draws a parallel to health problems reported by submarine personnel who also live in environments heavily shielded from natural EMFs.
That's a very insightful comparison, actually. The metallic hulls of submarines surrounded by conductive seawater create a pretty similar shielding effect to Weaver's iron-lined apartment.
Right.
And the health challenges faced by some submarine crews, they do further support the idea that prolonged absence of these natural EMFs can have negative biological consequences. It raises a really important question. Are we potentially trading one invisible risk for another when we try to completely block EMFs with shielding?
It certainly gives you pause.
Right.
So, okay, with this understanding of how metal shielding works, blocking both the good and the potentially concerning EMFs, let's turn to the paper's analysis of the various shielding methods and products available now. First up is shielding our homes against outdoor EMF sources, like from cell towers. What does the paper say about things like metal grids and EMF-blocking paints?
Well, the paper acknowledges that there are anecdotal accounts, particularly from individuals who identify as having electrohypersensitivity, who report some relief of their symptoms when they use these metal grids or special paints to shield their homes.
Okay.
However, and this is a crucial point, these reports are largely subjective. They haven't been validated by rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific studies. The authors rightly point out there's a significant element of subjective considerations in these personal accounts.
And it seems there's even a potential for these shielding measures to kind of backfire. The paper mentions reports where after an initial perceived benefit, symptoms can actually come back and even get worse. That sounds quite concerning.
It is. And apparently even some companies that sell these shielding materials have acknowledged these instances of symptom relapse in sensitive individuals. The theoretical danger here, as the paper emphasizes, is that a total permanent metal shield would, by its very nature, also permanently attenuate those vital natural EMFs we just discussed.
Right, the Schumann resonances.
Exactly. And as Weaver's experiments showed, that could have significant and negative long-term biological consequences. The authors also highlight the practical difficulty in even verifying if Schumann resonances are effectively penetrating these shields, given how weak these natural signals are and how easily they can be masked by the much stronger man-made ELF sources all around us now.
So it's really hard to know if you're inadvertently blocking something essential along with the EMFs you're trying to avoid. What about the idea of only partially shielding your home? Say, just the wall that faces a nearby cell tower. Is that maybe a better approach?
The paper suggests that partial or selective shielding can actually be more problematic.
Oh, really? How?
While man-made EMFs, like from cell towers, are often polarized, meaning their electric field oscillates in a specific direction. If you only shield a portion of your space, these polarized waves can bounce off the shielded surfaces and potentially combine with other waves in ways that create areas of unexpectedly increased intensity within your home. It's a phenomenon called constructive interference.
Like creating hotspots.
Exactly. Think of it like waves in water bouncing off a wall and creating bigger waves in certain spots. Plus, if the network of antennas in your area changes, and they do change, the effectiveness and even the safety of your partial shielding could be drastically altered, you might inadvertently create new hotspots of EMF exposure without even realizing it.
That's a really important and counterintuitive point. Okay, what about those small metal patches or even things like minerals like shunite that are often marketed as EMF protection? What's the scientific take on those?
The authors are quite direct about these types of products. They basically say they don't really align with the fundamental principles of EMF shielding we've been talking about. Remember, metallic objects tend to reflect and can even concentrate EMFs. So placing a small metal patch or a mineral like shunite close to your body or your devices could actually increase your local exposure by attracting and reflecting the surrounding electromagnetic fields.
That's the opposite effect.
Potentially, yes, in your immediate vicinity. There's just no scientifically plausible mechanism by which these small items could fundamentally alter or neutralize EMFs in a protective way. If anything, they might inadvertently make things worse locally.
Okay, so it sounds like trying to shield against outdoor EMF sources, especially with permanent or partial measures or with these smaller products, carries some pretty significant potential drawbacks and lacks strong scientific backing. Let's shift focus then to shielding against the EMFs from our own personal devices, like our smartphones. What about those health chips or EMF radiation protection chips you often see advertised?
Yeah, the paper is quite skeptical, to put it mildly. The authors state very clearly that there's simply no scientific basis for the claims that these small chips or stickers can significantly reduce radiation levels, alter the harmful effects of EMS, or somehow neutralize them. Yeah. Once an electromagnetic wave is emitted by a device, the only way to reduce its intensity is to attenuate it, basically. Reduce its power, usually by distance, or a substantial conductive barrier. A tiny sticker just isn't capable of doing that in any meaningful way.
And even if these chips did somehow manage to attenuate the signal, wouldn't that likely cause the device itself to compensate by boosting its power output?
Exactly. That's a key point. If a chip or sticker were actually effective at blocking the signal from your mobile phone, the phone would struggle to connect to the network.
Makes sense.
To maintain that connection, it would automatically increase its transmitting power, potentially leading to an even stronger local radiation exposure right next to your body.
Mm.
This is why, as the paper points out, it's generally not a good idea to put your phone in a completely sealed metal case while it's on an eye. It forces the phone to work harder to radiate more intensely.
Okay.
So yeah, the takeaway is that these little stickers could actually be making things worse, kind of like the partial shielding issue on a larger scale.
So these health chips, not only unlikely to work, but could even be counterproductive. The paper does briefly mention one study, though, that reported a chip having some effect on EEG activity. What do the authors make of that?
They acknowledge that single study did report some changes in human brainwave activity,
Hmm.
EEG, when a mobile phone with one of these chips was used compared to one without. However, they emphasized several critical limitations with that study.
Like what?
Well, the results were presented without detailed quantitative data, relying more on images that lack sufficient explanation. Crucially, the study didn't include any actual measurements of the EMFs emitted by the phones, either with or without the chip.
Oh,
And it failed to provide a clear, scientifically plausible mechanism for how the chip was supposed to produce these effects. The authors even noted that their attempts to get more clarification from the company producing the chip went unanswered.
not a good sign.
Not really. They conclude that much more rigorous, independent, peer-reviewed research with comprehensive EMF measurements and a clear explanation of the underlying mechanism would be absolutely necessary before any claims of protective effects from these types of products could be taken seriously.
Hmm.
One isolated study with significant methodological shortcomings just isn't enough to overturn the basic principles of physics.
Yeah, it really underscores the importance of being critical and looking for solid, reproducible scientific evidence rather than just relying on marketing claims, especially with these kinds of products. Okay, let's move on then to the concluding thoughts and recommendations from the authors of this review. What are the key takeaways from their overall analysis?
Well, the authors basically reiterate that the effectiveness and, really importantly, the long-term safety of most metal shielding products and practices currently available remain scientifically unproven.
Right.
They strongly emphasize the critical role that natural EMFs, particularly those Schumann resonances, appear to play in our fundamental biological rhythms. And they warn about the potential for negative health consequences if these natural fields are disrupted over extended periods by, say, permanent shielding.
And their concern is that even a subtle, long-term reduction in these already very weak Schumann signals could act as a kind of chronic stressor on our bodies.
That's their hypothesis, yeah, based
Mhm.
on the available evidence like Weaver's work. They suggest that a continuous, even if small, weakening of these natural environmental cues could disrupt our internal synchronization processes. It might force our bodies to expend more energy just to maintain homeostasis, balance. Over years, this chronic low-level stress could theoretically contribute to a weakening of the immune system and other health issues. It's kind of like constantly trying to keep your balance on a slightly uneven surface. It just takes more effort over time.
So, given these potential downsides, what's their main recommendation regarding the use of permanent metal shielding?
Their conclusion is quite cautious. They advise against the widespread use of permanent metal shielding until we have robust, long-term scientific data demonstrating its safety.
Okay.
They do mention that intermittent shielding, like using bed canopies made of metal mesh, specifically during sleep, might be a theoretically less risky approach compared to permanently shielding your entire living space or wearing shielding garments all the time.
Why less risky?
Well, the idea is that you'd only be reducing exposure to both man-made and natural EMFs for a portion of the day, maybe allowing your body to resynchronize during the remaining hours. However, and this is important, they're quick to point out that even this intermittent approach requires thorough long-term studies, ideally in animal models, to properly evaluate its safety and effectiveness. We simply don't know the long-term consequences yet.
Right, still lots of unknowns. What about those devices, sometimes called Schumann generators, that claim to emit frequencies mimicking these natural resonances? The paper touches on those too, doesn't it?
Yes. The authors acknowledge the concept of using devices that generate weak pulses intended to replicate the frequencies and waveforms of the Schumann resonances. The rationale is that these artificial signals might potentially compensate for the attenuation of natural EMFs caused by shielding. However, they strongly emphasize that the use of these Schumann generators, especially in conjunction with shielding, also requires significant and systematic long-term research. We need to determine both their efficacy and their safety.
So not a proven solution either.
Not yet, no. Introducing artificial electromagnetic signals into our environment, especially when we're also disrupting the natural background, is a really complex issue that needs careful study. We can't just assume they're beneficial without solid scientific evidence.
Okay, so if widespread metal shielding isn't the recommended solution at this point, what do the authors suggest as the most reliably safe way for us to minimize any potential harm from man-made EMFs in our daily lives?
Their primary and most strongly supported recommendation is actually quite straightforward. Focus on actively reducing our exposure to man-made EMFs in the first place, especially from our own personal electronic devices.
How?
They offer a number of practical strategies you can implement right away. Things like prioritizing wired connections for internet and landline phones whenever possible, keeping mobile phones at a distance from your body using speakerphone or air tube headsets, and limiting the use of regular wired headsets. Making phone calls as brief as possible, only when necessary.
Okay.
Switching your phone to airplane mode or turning it off completely when you're carrying it on your body and not actively using it. And keeping your phone at a significant distance, several meters if you can during the day.
Yeah.
And especially turning it off or keeping it far away while you sleep.
Simple avoidance, basically.
Exactly. They also advise against living in close proximity to known high-intensity EMF sources like cell towers or high-voltage power lines whenever that's feasible. These are all common sense avoidance strategies, based on the principle that reducing the source of exposure is the most direct way to minimize potential effects.
And they also have some advice for us as consumers when we encounter products claiming EMF protection.
Absolutely. They urge consumers to be highly critical of any product claiming health benefits related to EMF protection. They advise looking for solid support in the form of peer-reviewed scientific publications. These should detail rigorous testing methods and clearly explain the scientific mechanism by which the product is supposed to work.
Right.
They caution against relying on anecdotal evidence, marketing claims, or studies that haven't been published in reputable scientific journals or that might have clear conflicts of interest. The absence of robust scientific evidence should really be a major red flag.
So the overarching message from the authors seems to be, for now, the most responsible and evidence-based approach is to take proactive steps to minimize our own exposure to man-made EMF through these avoidance strategies, rather than relying on largely unproven and potentially problematic shielding technologies.
That's a concise and accurate summary of their conclusions, yeah. They end their review by expressing hope that it will stimulate further rigorous scientific research into the long-term effects of EMF shielding, maybe in conjunction with carefully studied methods of replicating natural EMFs. Because this is a complex and rapidly evolving area with significant implications for public health in our increasingly wireless world.
Well, this has been a truly illuminating deep dive into the science, or lack thereof sometimes, behind EMF shielding. The critical takeaway for you, our listener, seems to be that while the idea of a simple fix is appealing, the science paints a much more nuanced picture. Metal shielding can reduce EMF levels, yes, but it looks like a double-edged sword, potentially disrupting natural electromagnetic fields our bodies might rely on. Right now, the scientific evidence just doesn't strongly support the widespread or permanent use of most metal shielding products. Instead, the most evidence-based approach, it seems, is focusing on practical, achievable strategies to minimize your personal exposure to man-made EMFs from your own devices and surroundings.
And this leaves us with a pretty significant question to ponder, doesn't it? As our reliance on wireless technology just continues to explode, what are the long-term, maybe unintended consequences of fundamentally altering the electromagnetic environment we live in, the one we evolved in? What crucial research still needs to be done to truly understand these intricate interactions between the natural and man-made EMFs and our complex biology?
Yeah.
It really encourages you maybe to take a closer look at your own technology habits and just consider whether incorporating some of these simple avoidance strategies might be a worthwhile step.
Definitely food for thought. We hope this deep dive has given you a much clearer understanding of this complex and, let's face it, often confusing topic, all based on the available scientific evidence. Hopefully empowering you to make more informed decisions about EMF exposure and any potential solutions you might be considering. Thanks for diving deep with us.